Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is always the same. We take the sources, the articles, the research, and the rough notes you share with us, and we synthesize them into clarity. We give you the essential knowledge and the unexpected insights fast.
And today we are diving into a figure who is, she's maybe one of the most intellectually uncompromising and tragically dramatic philosophers of the entire 20th century, Simone Weil.
Weil lived such a short, intense life from 1909 to 1943, and she represents this extraordinary, almost impossible mix of identities.
It really is an impossible confluence. She was a radical political activist, a profound Christian mystic, and a truly foundational ethical thinker. Her life is just this study in paradox.
A paradox that few people could survive.
And in fact, she didn't.
It's immediately captivating. How can one person be known as the Red Virgin for her relentless political radicalism, but at the same time refuse to join the Communist Party?
Right. Or be this brilliant philosopher who literally walks away from academia to work in car factories. She deliberately sought out the deepest levels of suffering.
And then, maybe the most famous paradox of all, she becomes this mystic who has these incredibly powerful, repeated revelations of Christ, but ultimately and definitively refuses Catholic baptism right up until the day she died.
And that refusal to compromise, it extended into her final moments. Her commitment to justice and solidarity was so extreme, it demanded an actual physical price.
You're talking about her time in London.
Exactly. She was working for the Free French during the war, totally safe from the occupation. But she restricted her food intake to what she believed her compatriots in Nazi-occupied France were eating.
And she was already frail. She'd been diagnosed with tuberculosis.
Already frail.
Yeah.
So this act of self-imposed solidarity, it led directly to her death by heart failure.
Yeah.
She's just 34 years old.
That is the level of moral force we are dealing with here. And it just immediately begs the question, how did this mind work? So what's our mission today? Especially given that her major works, things like The Need for Roots, Gravity and Grace, they were all published posthumously. They were essentially stitched together from her essays, letters, and these chaotic notebooks.
Our mission is to trace the shape of her intellectual and physical pilgrimage. We have to go beyond the biography and really unpack the architecture of her thought.
Okay, so where do we start?
We'll follow her path. From this precocious radical student to a deeply disillusioned revolutionary, and then finally to the pioneering ethical thinker whose ideas still shape modern philosophy. We'll be laser-focused on three of her core revolutionary concepts: affliction, attention, and obligation, which, they really serve as the engines for her entire difficult worldview.
Okay, let's unpack this history. Simone Weil was born in Paris, 1909. She grew up in a secure, affluent, Alsatian Jewish family, though they were completely secular, totally agnostic.
Right, and we have to start with that environment, because it was just defined by sheer intellectual intensity. Her older brother, André, became one of the most renowned mathematicians of the 20th century.
The bar was set pretty high then.
Impossibly high. The source material really highlights this almost competitive intellectual drive she had from the very earliest age. To give you a taste of it. Weil and her brother André taught themselves ancient Greek when they were 12.
12.
Not to pass a test, but so they could speak to each other privately, without their parents or tutors understanding them.
That's a wild detail. It shows this early desire for direct, unmediated knowledge.
It does, and that same hunger for direct truth is what later drove her to learn Sanskrit, just so she could read the Bhagavad Gita in the original text.
So this intellectual power was there from the start, but it seems like it was immediately channeled into this powerful, almost painful sense of altruism.
Oh, absolutely. We see these signs of an exceptionally strong moral sentiment from childhood. It might have been influenced by the distress she felt when her father, who was a doctor, left for the front lines in World War I, right? At age 6, she reportedly sent her own share of sugar and chocolate to the soldiers. She just refused to consume comforts while others were suffering.
That act of solidarity, of identifying with the suffering, it came incredibly early for her.
It did. And by age 10, she was already declaring herself a Bolshevik and was encouraging workers at a family resort to unionize after she found out about their meager wages.
So this tendency toward total, uncompromising commitment was already in full bloom.
Completely. Scholars call it her lifelong vocation. It was also noted that she was highly sensitive, almost socially isolated. She actively rejected what she saw as feminine graces, wearing men's clothing, avoiding makeup. She seemed to believe she needed to sacrifice any chance at a conventional life to fully pursue her calling.
She certainly didn't blend in during her student years, studying under the philosopher Émile Chartier, known as Elaine.
No, her classmates were quick to label her. They kind of struggled to categorize her because she was so unusual. Her radical politics, she was constantly organizing against the military draft, that earned her the nickname the Red Virgin.
And her mentor, Elaine, he called her the Martian.
The Martian, yeah, suggesting she wasn't quite of this world. But I think the most insightful nickname was the one from her classmates, the categorical imperative in skirts.
That's perfect. It just captures her strict, almost mechanical devotion to moral law.
It really does. And this devotion was noticed by the authorities, too. I think she was even suspended from teaching later on for her defiance.
For her clothing.
For indifference to appropriate clothing, yes, and for ignoring a rule that banned women from smoking with male students. When she started teaching at LeQuay, she immediately turned her academic post into a political base. She was engaging in local activism, supporting underpaid striking workers, joining their marches.
She even held classes outdoors, right? Rejecting the formal classroom.
Yes, and fostering this family atmosphere among her students. She was also actively teaching French literature to workers in Saint-Étienne. She believed it was crucial for the revolution to give workers ownership over their own cultural heritage.
It's not just about marching, it's about empowerment through knowledge.
For her, it was essential. Culture and history were not to be owned by the elite. But this is also the period that gives us one of the great, if brief, intellectual confrontations of the century. Her meeting with Simone de Beauvoir.
Two absolute powerhouses. They finished first and second in their final exams, with Weil taking the top spot.
Right. And the confrontation itself just gets right to the heart of Weil's anti-elitist philosophy.
So what happened?
It was at the École Normale Supérieure. De Beauvoir, who would become this foundational existentialist philosopher, was talking about life's meaning, suggesting finding meaning was the ultimate goal, not just happiness.
And Weil's response
Was brutal in its clarity. She asserted that one thing alone mattered in the world today, the revolution that would feed all people on Earth. And then she dismissed de Beauvoir's abstraction with the line, "It's easy to see you've never gone hungry."
Wow. That's a profound dismissal. It grounds her entire philosophy in material, bodily suffering, placing it way above abstract intellectual pursuits.
It speaks volumes. And it's why her early political identity, Marxist, pacifist, trade unionist, was also destined to break down. She started writing political tracts and marching constantly, but her faith in the Marxist project just dissolved in her 20s.
So where did that disillusionment begin? She was so committed to the working class.
Well, the disillusionment was based, ironically, on that very commitment. First, she felt that Marxist theorists couldn't truly understand oppression because, in her view, they themselves have never been cogs in the machinery of factory.
The analysis was too theoretical.
Too divorced from the gritty daily reality of physical toil. The intellectuals analyzing the machine had never been caught in the gears themselves.
And what was the second part of her critique? The warning about a new form of tyranny.
This part is critical because it's almost prophetic. She was one of the first thinkers to identify a new form of oppression that Marx hadn't anticipated, the rise of elite bureaucrats and managerial classes. She argued that these bureaucrats, regardless of the political system, capitalist or revolutionary, could be just as exploitative, just as detached, and make life just as miserable for ordinary people as the most rapacious capitalists.
So she saw that power itself was the corrupting force, not just economic ownership. This analysis even brought her face-to-face with Leon Trotsky, didn't it?
It did, in 1933. She actually arranged for Trotsky to stay at her parents' apartment while he was exiled and hiding from Stalin's agents.
That's incredible.
And she reportedly managed to hold her own intellectually against the founder of the Red Army, challenging his views on the Soviet state and the corruption of power. Her critique focused on how any form of collective power, even a revolutionary party, inevitably creates a hierarchy that oppresses the individual.
And this pessimism about political solutions, it extended to the very concept of revolution itself.
By the end, she concluded that revolution had become an empty word. A concept, she said, for which you kill, for which you die, but which does not possess any content.
She realized it was a dead end.
A dead end, because the nature of power always ensures that the revolution just replaces one tyrant with another. And this intense pessimism is what pushes her into the next, even more radical phase of her life.
So if intellectual critique and political activism weren't enough, she needed truth based in something lived or experienced.
Yes.
And that's what led her to take that radical, some might say insane, step of abandoning her privileged teaching post to enter the factory.
It was a conscious, philosophical experiment. In 1934, she took a year-long leave to work incognito as a laborer in two major factories, Alstom and Renault. She didn't do this for research. She did it because she felt her intellectual work was too elite, too detached.
She needed to know what it meant to be a worker, a cog in the system.
Exactly. And this experience, which was physically and psychologically crushing, it became the crucible for her most defining concept, le malheur, or affliction.
Okay, let's spend some real time defining affliction, because it's so much more than just suffering or pain. When we talk about Weil's affliction, what are the key components that make it a suffering plus?
Right. Affliction is a state of total involuntary dehumanization. It's multifaceted. First, you have the physical torment,
The exhaustion, the hunger.
constant grinding pain. The body is just reduced to a mechanism. Then second, there's the psychological distress, the constant fear of the foreman, the humiliation of being replaceable, the complete loss of agency.
And the third part is the social degradation.
The social degradation. Being stripped of your identity, reduced to a statistic, the piece of industrial brawn, and you internalize the scorn of the world.
She details the sensory experience of the factory so vividly in her notebooks. The forced repetition, the constant noise, the pressure to maintain a speed that was just beyond human capacity.
She wrote about the feeling of her soul being branded with a mark akin to slavery. She was constantly being berated, sometimes unjustly, and because she was often clumsy, she struggled mightily with the fast-paced, machine-like tasks.
And she was shocked that the workers couldn't even think about rebellion.
She realized the machine was designed to exhaust their very capacity for coherent thought.
So, affliction is destructive because it annihilates the ego's ability to resist or even to perceive justice?
Precisely. Weil wrote that thought flies from affliction as promptly and irresistibly as an animal flees from death. It strips away all human capacity, isolates the individual, and imposes this crushing sense of self-loathing even on the innocent sufferer.
It's the involuntary or complete annihilation of the self.
It compels the constant asking of why, a question for which the material world offers no reply.
And yet, after experiencing this involuntary destruction, she then volunteers to fight in the Spanish Civil War in 1936. She joins the Republican faction despite being a lifelong pacifist. How do you square that contradiction?
It just highlights the primacy of action in her ethics. She went because she believed the rise of fascism demanded a response, even one that violated her deeply held belief in nonviolence. She traveled to Spain seeking out the anarchist Durruti Column.
Which was known for being particularly radical and high risk.
Exactly. But she didn't exactly thrive in the field.
No, the anecdotes are.
Yeah.
Well, they're quite humbling.
They are. Weil was extremely nearsighted, notoriously clumsy. Her comrades often had to physically prevent her from joining missions because she was such a liability.
There's the story about the machine gun.
The famous story, yeah. She tried to operate the group's heavy machine gun during an air raid, and her comrades had to stop her, gently insisting that someone less prone to accidents should handle it. Her participation was limited to just a few weeks before she accidentally stepped into a pot of boiling oil over a cooking fire.
Ow.
Burned herself badly, which forced her to leave Spain and recuperate in Assisi.
But the physical accident was minor compared to the profound moral crisis the war ignited in her.
That's the lasting takeaway. While in Spain, she witnessed the brutal excesses of the Republican side, including the execution of a 15-year-old Falangist prisoner.
And that horrified her.
It led to this terrible self-realization. She wrote, "I felt the possibility of doing the same, and it's precisely because I felt I had that potential that I was horrified."
So the war taught her that the intoxicating power of force corrupted everyone, victors and victims alike.
Exactly. And this is the genesis of her powerful 1939 essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. She defined force as the impersonal X, which turns anyone subjected to it into a thing.
The real hero of the Iliad, she argued, isn't Achilles or Hector.
It's force itself. It's an engine that just blinds the human spirit and sweeps away moral reasoning, damaging all who wield it and all who suffer under it. It's a devastating meditation on the mechanical nature of power.
So factory work gave her the concept of affliction, the destructive force on the individual soul. And war gave her force, the political power that reduces people to objects. With this, she renounces political pacifism entirely.
She does. After the rise of Nazi Germany, she stated, "Nonviolence is good only if it's effective." She fled Paris to Marseille, where she joined the French resistance, delivering the underground paper, the Cahiers du Témoignage.
And even facing threats, she maintained that radical posture.
Oh, yeah. When police threatened to jail her with the whores if she didn't cooperate, she reportedly welcomed the suggestion. She just refused to compromise her identity with the marginalized.
She eventually made her way to London to work for the Free French government in exile in 1942. And this is the critical period where she writes The Need for Roots.
Right, and this London period is just defined by intense frustration. She felt she was too safe, too physically distanced from the suffering in occupied France. Her job was to analyze resistance reports, but she felt she wasn't doing enough.
So she kept sending these proposals to Charles de Gaulle.
Proposal after proposal, some of them truly extreme, asking to be sent back as a frontline nurse or a covert agent. She wanted to physically share the fate of her countrymen.
And de Gaulle's legendary response suggests he struggled with her moral intensity.
He was known to have been deeply influenced by her ideas, particularly in the need for roots, but he reportedly considered her insane because of the extremity of her commitment.
He admired the moral force, but her suggestions were
Wholly impractical for a military leader. But her intense focus on France's moral and spiritual regeneration after the war is what led her to write so furiously during this time, producing her great political essays.
She really used her own sense of unrootedness in London to imagine what France truly needed to be whole again. This brings us to the profound spiritual pivot in her life, which runs parallel to her political development. Raised completely secular, agnostic Jewish family, yet she said she always had a Christian outlook. So how does this intellectual, political radical become a mystic?
Her spiritual transformation was driven by sensory and physical encounters, not just by reading theology. She called these the events that delivered me into Christ's hands as his captive.
Tell us about the three pivotal experiences.
The first one was in 1935, during a holiday in Portugal. She was watching a procession of villagers singing hymns, and the sheer, unadulterated beauty and devotion just moved her physically.
And she had a sudden conviction.
An overwhelming conviction that Christianity is preeminently the religion of slaves, that slaves cannot help belonging to it, and she, among others, noticed that connection. She didn't find Christ in a church. She found him among the marginalized.
In Religion of the Oppressed, the second experience links her to St. Francis of Assisi.
Yes. In 1937, while recuperating from her injury in Spain, she visited Assisi. In the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli, where St. Francis himself had prayed, she found this tiny Romanesque chapel, the Little Portion.
And in that symbol space,
she experienced a religious ecstasy and prayed for the first time in her life. It was this profound, unexpected moment of grace, breaking through all the political and physical despair.
And the most famous revelation that involves reciting poetry.
In 1938, yeah. While reciting George Herbert's powerful poem, Love the Third, she had a revelation so intense that she wrote that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. From that point on, her writing, though still political, became explicitly mystical.
But here is the massive, irreducible paradox. Despite this intense conversion, she categorically refused to be baptized. Why?
This is the critical line she would not cross. She said she preferred to remain outside the church due to the love of those things that are outside Christianity.
So it wasn't a rejection of Christ?
Not at all. It was a condemnation of the church as an institution, its history of power, its dogma.
What specifically about the institution repelled her so much?
She was vehemently against the concept of anathema set, the idea of drawing hard lines between who is saved and who is not, of separating from unbelievers.
And you felt it was incompatible with humility?
Absolutely. She believed true humility was incompatible with belonging to any group chosen by God, whether that's a nation or a church. For while belonging to a privileged group, spiritual or political, always leads to pride and the denial of the reality of those outside it.
That's a powerful critique. She saw belonging itself as a spiritual impurity.
She did. She criticized the church's entanglement with social convention and the interests of exploiters. She sought authentic Christian inspiration only in the mystics, who were often themselves condemned or marginalized by the church hierarchy.
And her spiritual quest was exceptionally broad, too. She wasn't just attracted to Christian mysticism.
Her curiosity was vast and non-sectarian. She found genuine divine revelation in the Greek and Egyptian mysteries, in Hinduism, especially the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, and Mahayana Buddhism.
She explicitly said those traditions delivered her to Christ just as much as Christian ones.
She did. She wrote, Greece, Egypt, ancient India. These things have done as much as the visibly Christian ones to deliver me to Christ's hands as captive. I think I might even say more.
So she finds equal spiritual truth in all these major traditions, but she rejects the idea of synthesizing them into one easy, unified spirituality.
That's the key philosophical maneuver. She opposed synthesis. She insisted a synthesis of religion implies a lower quality of attention. For Weil, purity comes from radical, intense focus.
So each religion is alone true.
Each religion is alone true. That is to say that at the moment we are thinking of it, we must bring as much attention to bear on it as if there were nothing else. We have to give each tradition its complete, uncompromised attention.
This intense focus leads us into her complex cosmology, particularly the concept of divine absence. If God is perfect and creation contains evil, how does creation exist?
Her cosmology is a theodicy, an explanation for evil. She believed God created the world not by adding something, but by an act of self-delimitation, a withdrawal, which she termed kenosis.
So creation exists precisely where God is not present in his perfect fullness.
Exactly. Therefore, creation necessarily contains imperfection and evil.
You mentioned this mirrors a concept in Jewish thought. For listeners who might not be familiar, what's the analogy here?
It's strikingly similar to the concept of Tzimtzum in Jewish Kabbalah. Tzimtzum is the idea that for the finite world to exist, the infinite God had to contract or withdraw his infinite light, creating an empty space where existence could happen.
So for Weil, this withdrawal allows for necessity and freedom, and it explains why the world is inherently afflicted.
Right. Evil isn't the result of some ancient mistake or original sin. It's a necessary structural component of existence, a consequence of God withdrawing to make space for freedom and matter.
And paradoxically, evil and affliction then serve a role.
They serve the role of driving humans back toward God by revealing the depth of human misery that was already present.
We have to return to the ultimate tragic expression of her ethical life, her death. Was this final act of self-imposed starvation a moral choice or a physical failure?
It remains intensely debated. She died in August 1943 from cardiac failure at 34. The cause was her refusing special treatment and severely restricting his food intake in solidarity with occupied France.
And the coroner's verdict at the time was?
It was that she did kill and slay herself by refusing to eat whilst the balance of her mind was disturbed.
That suggests suicide, or at least self-inflicted death while mentally unstable.
Yes. But her first significant biographer, Simone Weil, strongly disputed this. She pointed to letters written shortly before her death where Weil requested and ate a little food.
So Petramon's argument is that it wasn't a conscious act of suicide.
She suggests that Weil's already frail, tuberculous body had just deteriorated to the point where it could no longer process food. So her inability to eat was a physical failure caused by her underlying poor health.
So the question remains, was she trying to voluntarily starve herself? Or did her extreme commitment simply push her frail body past the point of no return?
Richard Rees, her first English biographer, offered the most moving synthesis. He just said she died of love. He pointed to her overwhelming compassion and her desire to imitate Christ's suffering.
So regardless of the specifics, her final act just underscores that seamless link between her mystical faith and her political commitment to solidarity.
She died living out the moral imperative she had set for herself.
Let's shift our focus now to the core of her intellectual legacy, which crystallizes these experiences. We have the crushing force of affliction from the factory. So what's the voluntary moral response she proposes? We start with the ethical foundation, attention.
Attention is the absolute foundation of her ethical life. She famously called it the very substance of prayer. And it's not passive, like daydreaming. It is an active, radical, conscious act of suspending the self, of emptying one's thought process she called Seefeder.
So we empty our thought. Why? What fills that void?
The void is filled by the reality of the other person or God in their full truth. She says that the capacity to give attention to a sufferer is almost a miracle. It is a miracle.
And it requires letting go of the ego's demands.
Completely, allowing the other person to exist just as he is.
How does this attention contrast with something like pity or charity?
She provides a profound contrast. Pity, in her view, is often selfish. We use pity to alleviate our own discomfort at seeing suffering, or worse, to enjoy the comfortable distance between ourselves and the afflicted person.
Pity is self-centered.
Right. True attention, however, is selfless. It's a full recognition that the sufferer is a real being, not a specimen, and it requires a form of mental effort that's like spiritual heavy lifting.
And the attention is the necessary precursor to justice.
In fact, for a while, attention is justice. Justice consists of seeing that no harm comes to those whom we have noticed as real beings. To harm someone is to take something from them, to expand your own sense of self by creating an emptiness in the other. Attention reverses that,
It's the rarest and purest form of generosity.
because it gives the other person space in reality without seeking to appropriate or consume them.
This philosophy leads her to a concept she borrowed from Plato to describe how separation and connection work simultaneously. Metaxou.
Metaxou, it literally means between or intermediate. It's a concept that the very things that seem to separate us from the divine, our bodies, the material world, are paradoxically the only things that allow us to communicate with it.
They are both a separation and a link.
Yes. She gives this famous prisoner metaphor. She says, two prisoners whose cells adjoin communicate with each other by knocking on the wall. The wall is the thing which separates them, but it is also their means of communication.
It's the same with us and God.
Every separation is a link. Our physical body, the laws of the material world, everything we experience as limiting gravity is actually the blind man's stick, allowing us to feel out the reality beyond ourselves.
So the distance isn't a failure, it's a necessary condition of communication. This leads us to the title of her famous notebooks, Gravity and Grace.
These are the two fundamental forces governing existence. Gravity is the force of the natural world. Physical necessity, material constraints, social structures, and the ego's pull towards self-preservation. It's the law that constantly drags us down.
And grace is the counterbalance.
Grace is the counterbalance, motivated by the goodness of God. But the crucial part is how grace works. It works through decreation.
Decreation. That sounds like the opposite of God's initial creative act. If creation was God making space by withdrawing, what is decreation?
Decreation is the voluntary destruction of the self, or the ego. If affliction is the involuntary destruction imposed by external force, decreation is the voluntary dismantling of the I, by choice.
And she calls this passive activity.
Or, borrowing from the Bhagavad Gita, non-active action.
So why must the self be destroyed?
Because the self is driven by illusions. It's motivated by fantasy-imagined debts others owe us, rewards we fantasize about. These imaginary constructs are dangerous because, unlike real rewards, they are limitless. They cloud our perception of reality.
So the ego is bound by the laws of gravity.
Constantly seeking to expand and appropriate. The work of grace is to strip away these illusions and destroy the ego so the soul can participate in the divine. When we consent to the necessities of the world, when the self is dismantled, we make space for reality and truth.
So the fundamental human choice is, will you be involuntarily crushed by affliction and gravity, or will you choose the voluntary annihilation of the ego, decreation, to become fully human?
Precisely. It's the ethical demand she places on every individual. And this ethical framework then becomes the blueprint for her political masterpiece, The Need for Roots, where she fundamentally critiques the focus on rights.
She advocates for a nation built on obligations and needs, not rights. Why did she find a system built on rights so insufficient?
For a while, rights are conditional and inherently competitive. A system built on rights encourages self-interest, the constant assertion of what I am owed. This leads to moral laziness because the individual is just focused outward, demanding from others.
She flips the traditional moral perspective completely.
Yes. She establishes a hierarchy. A man, considered in isolation, only has duties. Other men, seen from his point of view, only have rights.
So in isolation, you have duties but no rights, whatever.
Exactly. And she argues that obligations alone are eternal, unconditional, independent of circumstance. The duty to the human being as such, that alone is eternal. Rights are always conditional. They only exist in relation to a corresponding obligation.
So a culture centered on rights makes us turn away from suffering.
Because we lack the moral strength to confront its extreme expressions, like affliction. Obligations, however, demand continuous moral output, whether or not the conditions are favorable.
This focus on obligation connects directly to her concept of rootedness, l'enseignement, which she sees as an essential spiritual and political need.
Rootedness is the spiritual need for real, active, and natural participation in a community. This community must preserve the treasures of the past, tradition and culture, but also the aspirations of the future.
So roots provide nourishment from place, birth, and occupation.
Right. And the counterforce to this is uprootedness, déracinement,
which she saw as the great spiritual threat to the soul caused by conquest, colonialism,
and economic domination. She argues that the greatest agent of uprootedness is money. Money, she said, destroys human roots wherever it is able to penetrate. Why? because the effort, the acquisition of money demands of the mind is so much less than the effort demanded by other, more spiritual motives, like love or beauty or skill.
So she saw industrial workers as geographically stationary but morally uprooted. How did she propose to fix this? Through her vision of the spiritual nature of work.
She believed work had to be reconfigured as a moral and metaphysical act. She advocated for abolishing large-scale factories in favor of smaller, decentralized workshops, where machinery would be owned by individuals or cooperatives.
Working and thinking must not be separated.
They can't be. The physical labor must engage the intellect and spirit alongside the body. She argues that if people can have both spiritual and scientific ideas converging in the act of work, even the fatigue and toil can be transformed.
So the pain can become something else.
It can be converted into the pain that makes the beauty of the world penetrates right into the core of the human body. She claimed that consenting to work is second only to consenting to death. Both are essential, difficult acts of submission that lead to spiritual growth.
Let's bring this full circle back to the divine through her concept of beauty.
For Weil, beauty is the highest link between matter and spirit. It links justice, attention, and God. She provides one of the most powerful definitions of love I've ever read. The love of the beauty of the world is the only pure love.
It is the love that enables us to look at things without trying to appropriate them.
Right there. That's the key. Non-appropriation. The beautiful is that which we desire without wishing to eat it, without wishing to possess it, consume it, or use it for our ego's benefit.
It's the full affirmation of a thing's existence.
And theologically, she saw beauty as the experiential proof that the incarnation is possible. She called it Christ's tender smile coming to us through matter. It serves a soteriological function, a pathway to salvation, because it captivates the flesh, bypassing the self and letting truth penetrate directly to the soul.
Weil died largely unknown, a fringe figure. But what happened in the decades immediately after her death is extraordinary. Her posthumous fame just exploded.
It did. She rapidly became one of the most widely influential figures on religious and spiritual matters in the third quarter of the 20th century. Her framework provided a necessary corrective to post-war cynicism.
And her admirers were foundational intellectuals and global leaders.
Oh, yeah. Albert Camus called her the only great spirit of our times. Pope Paul VI cited her as one of his 3 greatest influences.
Alongside Pascal and Bernanos.
Right. T.S. Eliot, Iris Murdoch, the Trappist monk Thomas Merton, all were deeply affected by her. Biographer Robert Coles called her a giant of reflection.
But this radical figure, who saw the world so clearly divided, she certainly garnered sharp criticism too, even from her admirers.
Her judgments were sometimes considered intemperate. Even T.S. Eliot noted her tendency to divide the world into stark categories of good and evil. For example, she was a fierce, relentless critic of the Roman Empire. She refused to see any value whatsoever in figures like Virgil or Marcus Aurelius.
You just saw them purely through the lens of institutionalized oppression.
Exactly. And the criticism regarding her own background is particularly complex and sensitive.
Her critique of Judaism.
It is. She was an uncompromising critic of what she perceived as the excessive influence of the Old Testament on Western civilization, sometimes using harsh language.
Right.
This led some Jewish writers, including Susan Sontag, to accuse her of anti-Semitism.
But others, including her own family, disagree.
Right. They argue she was deeply influenced by Jewish ethical precepts and was critiquing what she saw as the pride inherent in any group chosen by God, including the church she refused to join. It's a nuanced and difficult part of her legacy.
That tension, the prophet, seen as a saint by some and as psychologically unbalanced by others, ensured her legacy. She wasn't just an academic. She was a moral genius whose life demanded the world's attention.
And her relevance persists today across an astonishing range of fields, from political philosophy and ethics to ergonomics and classical studies. Her ideas about rootedness and the dehumanization of work feel more relevant than ever in our age of the gig economy and digital uprootedness.
So how does this intense 1930s era ethical framework connect to us today?
Well, her critiques of uprootedness and her demand for attention speak directly to modern alienation, the gig economy, surveillance capitalism. It often mirrors the factory experience she described. Workers are geographically stationary but fundamentally unrooted, reduced to data points.
And her solution, that true work must engage the mind and spirit, challenges us to look beyond just economic utility.
It does. And we even see her influence in contemporary art and music, which is a testament to the enduring power of her concepts.
Right, like Kaija Sarayaho's opera La Passana de Simone.
And Chris Krause's film Gravity and Grace. And surprisingly, Her philosophy is cited as a significant influence on the Spanish musician Rosalia's album Lux.
Specifically in relation to her unique definition of love, that concept that pure love requires consenting to distance.
Correct. Rosalia cited Weil's idea that to love purely is to consent to distance. It is to adore the distance between ourselves and that which we love. This ties directly back to Metaxu, that separation is a necessary link, and the definition of beauty as non-appropriation. To truly love something, you have to resist that gravitational urge to consume it.
So as we wrap up this intense deep dive, let's quickly reiterate those three foundational pillars of her revolutionary thought.
Okay, first there's affliction, the malheur. Not just suffering, but the torment that isolates, degrades, and involuntarily destroys the soul's capacity to say I or seek justice.
Second, attention. The miraculous, active, self-emptying state of mind required to truly perceive the reality of the sufferer, which is the foundational act of justice.
And third, obligation. The eternal, unconditional duty we owe to the human being, which must precede and ground any conditional claims of rights.
It is an overwhelming body of work built on a foundation of total, unrelenting commitment. So if we strip away the biography and the theology, what is the core moral challenge Simone Weil leaves for us, for you?
I think the tension she lived and wrote about between the crushing mechanical necessity of the material world, which she called gravity, and the possibility of spiritual openness, or grace, is ultimately presented as a fundamental choice. We have to decide whether to be involuntarily destroyed by affliction or whether to embrace the voluntary destruction of the ego decreation, to actively empty ourselves and make space for the divine and the reality of the other.
That's the challenge.
That's the challenge. And so the question is this. If, as Weil claims, the love of the world's beauty is the only pure love because it requires us not to appropriate but merely to affirm existence, how might applying this form of pure attention change the way we approach politics, work, and justice in our own uprooted world? That is the demanding yet liberating question she leaves for you to consider.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are plunging into the remarkable, often contradictory, and profoundly challenging life and philosophy of Simone Weil, a figure whose brief 34 years were characterized by this just fierce refusal to live a comfortable life, choosing instead to engage directly with the greatest suffering of her time.
She really is a philosopher of radical tension. I mean, Weil's thought is defined by its intensity, a constant, almost painful oscillation between extreme political commitment, social critique, and then the deep, silent solitude of mystical contemplation. She forces you to confront the meaning of justice when you're looking at the stark, impersonal realities of force and necessity.
And that tension, it brings us directly to the core question we have to address today. Her critical concept of malheur, or affliction. So we're asking, is Weil's concept of affliction fundamentally a political and social critique of oppression that demands structural reform, right here on Earth? Or is it primarily a metaphysical and spiritual necessity that serves as a pathway to divine grace and the destruction of the self?
And this distinction is just crucial because it really determines the focus of her legacy. I'll be arguing that while her commitment to the oppressed was, well, absolute, her ultimate framework, particularly her definitions of evil and suffering, is transcendent. Her activism serves a spiritual logic aimed at union with the divine.
And I'll present the case that her most enduring and practical contributions, her definitions of force, obligation, the profound need for rootedness, are the direct product of her material, social, and political commitments, and that these demand structural change to alleviate human suffering. So my perspective is grounded in the material reality Weil dedicated her life to analyzing and to sharing. Weil wasn't content to merely observe suffering. She deliberately immersed herself in the most brutal conditions. Her year working as a common laborer in the factories of Alstom and Renault in 1934 was the absolute crucible for her mature philosophy. This experience, which physically and spiritually just broke her, taught her that affliction, malheur, it isn't just pain or misfortune. It's a specific social state imposed by power. It is the state where the human soul is effectively destroyed by the repetitive machine-like grind of industrial labor. She saw that workers were reduced to this almost animalistic state where, real thought or rebellion became utterly impossible. This dehumanization, this transformation into an automaton, is a political reality imposed by the structure of la puissance, or force. And this social critique is powerfully detailed in her earlier essay, The Iliad or the Poem of Force, where she gives her famous definition of force as that X which turns anyone subject to it into a thing. This force is embodied by the factory owner, the machine, the crushing bureaucratic state. Her response was always practical. She wrote Oppression and Liberty to analyze the mechanics of power, and later advocated for a free France rebuilt not on vague rights, which she believed were abstract and empty, but on concrete obligations. And crucially, she proposed radical structural solutions, like abolishing large centralized factories in favor of decentralized workshops, where workers could own their own machinery, and thereby mitigate that profound sense of déracinement, the uprootedness and alienation of modern society. For her, the crisis is social, and therefore the primary solution has to be social.
I see why you emphasize her political action. It is certainly the most visible and dramatic element of her biography, but I would frame her social critique as a manifestation of a deeper, pre-existing metaphysical conviction. Weil was struggling to answer the timeless theological problem: why does evil exist in a world created by a good God? For Weil, affliction is the central cornerstone of her theodicy, tied directly to the Platonic and Christian concept of absence. God, in a profound act of self-delimitation or kenosis, an emptying out, withdrew some measure of divine fullness to make space for creation. This means that existence itself is structured on a necessary flaw, on the impersonal mechanisms of gravity and necessity. So evil in this view, it isn't a failure of the world. It's the necessary condition of a created world separate from God. She crystallized this view when she stated, quite radically, that evil is the form which God's mercy takes in this world. The function of affliction, therefore, is primarily spiritual. Nothing but extreme suffering can successfully strip away the illusions of the self, the ego, the I, which Weil saw as the ultimate idol separating us from God. And when this self-destruction is accepted, embraced, she calls it decreation. Decreation is the voluntary emptying of the self, and it's necessary to receive the divine impersonal light. Her profound religious encounters in Assisi during the recitation of George Herbert's poem Love 3, these were revelations that confirmed suffering's primary role is to drive humans toward this act of decreation. The two great idols she identifies are the self and the social, which suggests the primary struggle is always internal, focused on purifying one's own will and attention, transcending mere political reform.
Okay, but if affliction were solely a metaphysical necessity, why did Weil dedicate her final years, even while she was ill, to constructing the need for roots? This work is not a theological treatise. It's an intensely detailed, highly prescriptive political and economic blueprint. And that, to me, proves that she viewed material conditions as the barrier that must be overcome before any spiritual progress can be genuinely accessible to the suffering. Look at the specifics. She insists on limiting working hours, establishing cooperatives, combining manual labor with intellectual education. Why? Because the uprooted worker, the one suffering from déracinement, simply cannot achieve genuine attention or spiritual insight. She argues for the spiritual nature of work, but she insists that this spirituality is impossible under the external pressures of factory force. The political solution is structural. It has to transform the environment to allow workers to feel at home and thus capable of the spiritual act of consent.
I grant you that the proposals in the need for roots are intensely practical, but I'm not convinced that practicality dictates the primacy of the solution. Weil's proposals are simply the creation of the least harmful environment in which the necessary spiritual work can then occur. We are arguing about priority here. For Weil, the core act is consent to necessity. She stated that consent to work, like consent to death, is an act of submission to the impersonal divine structure of the world. Even in an ideal workshop, the worker still must consent to the mechanical reality of the task, submitting their ego. She makes this distinction very clear. This crucial type of consent is obtained metaphysically through decreation rather than through effort. The decentralized workshop is the ideal setting because it minimizes Poussin's human force, oppression. But the true spiritual breakthrough is the internal act of decreation. It's the voluntary destruction of the self. If the political project were primary, she would have called for revolution. Instead, she called for spiritual renunciation within modified structures.
But that risks spiritualizing away the suffering of the majority. I mean, if the internal mechanism, decreation, is primary, what's the moral imperative for the non-afflicted to engage in structural reform? Weil's own experience showed her that the social force, the malheur imposed by the system, it often renders decreation impossible because it destroys the capacity for thought itself. A starving, physically exhausted person cannot engage in sustained spiritual discipline. Her detailed economic plans serve as proof that she believed the human social environment has to be structurally ready for grace to penetrate. The removal of the external barrier of oppression isn't secondary. It's the precondition for the individual to freely submit to divine necessity, rather than being forced into a servile submission to human power. She wasn't seeking merely to modify the environment. She was trying to structure society according to a universal spiritual truth, the need for human dignity, which required material manifestation.
Right, but the imperative isn't just about achieving spiritual progress for the individual. It's about justice. And for Weil, justice is inextricably tied to attention. The non-afflicted must remove the external oppression, the puissance, because true attention mandates it. If you believe, as I do, that Weil's ultimate concern was the proper alignment of the soul with the eternal, then a political action simply flows from that alignment. And let's delve deeper into this ethical core. Attention. Weil equates pure attention to the very substance of prayer. It's a spiritual discipline, the suspension of self-centered, interested thought that allows the soul to receive the reality of the other or to receive God. Justice is defined precisely in this spiritual light. She says, justice consists in seeing that no harm comes to those whom we have noticed as real beings. The act of noticing the reality of the afflicted person requires the ego to be quieted, which is a result of decreation. This ethical mandate is rooted in the impersonal. It's triggered by beauty, which captivates the flesh and compels attention, bypassing the self. So if the substance of justice is attention, and attention is prayer, the ultimate standard of morality and the drive for ethical action must be derived from the spiritual sphere, from the achieved state of selflessness.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it risks turning her fierce ethical critique into a kind of passive contemplation. While attention is absolutely central, its purpose for Weil was always to anchor effective, real-world morality, not just to quiet the self. I mean, Weil spent enormous energy critiquing abstract political terms and the power of words, precisely because they led to an action. Her focus on obligation is the practical antidote to passive attention. She views obligations as universal and non-negotiable. She says a man left alone in the universe would have no rights whatsoever, but he would have obligations. Obligations are directed toward the concrete needs of the human soul, rootedness, security, truth, all of which require active material protection. The moral strength to confront affliction and prevent harm requires actively intervening to prevent the source of that social puissance. The obligation is a directive for structural physical change. It demands we move beyond the spiritual gaze and into political intervention.
But the moral force of that obligation is derived from a spiritual, a transcendent source. I mean, why does she insist on obligation over rights? Because rights are conditional. They're social contracts. Obligation is absolute, derived from the divine order of the world. She saw political action as a necessary but secondary expression of this absolute standard. Consider her analogy of gravity and grace. Gravity is a tendency of the self to fall, to cling to the ego and the social idols. Grace is the power that lifts us toward the impersonal. Political action for Weil is the struggle against the gravitational pull of human power, the puissance, so that the divine force of grace can work internally. It's an enabling mechanism, not the ultimate goal. If we could change the internal structure of the self through pure decreation, the oppressive social structures would cease to matter entirely. The ultimate failure is spiritual, even if the symptoms are social.
If the ultimate failure were purely spiritual, why did she choose to live the way she did? Her decisions were a radical, embodied political statement. She chose to leave the classroom, to work in the factory, to understand the oppressed. Then she went to Spain to fight fascism, and finally she worked for the resistance movement. These are not the actions of someone whose ultimate allegiance is solely to internal renunciation. She constantly sought the concrete intersection where internal conviction manifested as external political solidarity. Well, if we look at the culmination of her life, her political commitment in her final years is undeniable evidence of her priority. Despite her severe tuberculosis diagnosis, she refused to accept the special privileges of the Free French government in London, meticulously working on reports and proposals, the most famous of which is The Need for Roots, intended to build a morally sound post-war France. More profoundly, her physical suffering in 1943 was a conscious political act of solidarity. She restricted her own diet to the rations she believed residents in Nazi-occupied France were eating. Her death at 34 was directly caused by cardiac failure linked to this self-imposed starvation. This goes so far beyond mere personal asceticism. It was an ultimate, embodied act of radical political compassion, an attempt to provide a living, inspiring moral opposite to Nazism's ideology of brutal force. Her mysticism was the tool that sharpened her ability to commit this final, concrete sacrifice for the oppressed.
That is a compelling argument regarding solidarity, and I agree, her final suffering was monumental. However, I believe we miss the ultimate point if we label it merely political solidarity. It was the absolute radical expression of her spiritual commitment to live out the demands of her metaphysics, the physics of necessity and grace. Her belief was that only through the destruction of the self, through the acceptance of suffering, could one participate in the divine reality. Her self-denial was the culmination of her philosophy of decreation, testing its limits against the crushing reality of physical necessity. It was her refusal to accept any barrier between her internal conviction and the external mechanical world.
And we also have to remember her complex relationship with institutional Christianity. Her refusal of baptism stemmed from what she called the love of those things that are outside Christianity, including Hindu philosophy, Greek texts, Buddhist wisdom.
She understood that complex human reality required multiple perspectives, reflected in her Platonic concept of metaxou. Metaxou means every separation is a link. The separation of the individual from the body, from society, and yes, from God, creates the very links by which we are tethered to the divine. Her struggle was to live out divine love within the constraints of the physical, making her body the final site of the conflict between gravity, or necessity, and grace, or love. And this is ultimately a spiritual project that consumes the political.
But the power of that metaxou, that linking separation, is only realized when the political and material suffering is acknowledged as real and requiring intervention. She didn't say, ignore the factory. She said, transform the factory. She didn't say, ignore rights. She said, replace them with the stronger moral force of obligations. Her final act of starvation was a protest against the political situation that was killing her compatriots, not merely a resignation to her physical fate. Her spiritual insight demanded political expression, making the social critique the engine of her entire moral life.
And I maintain the spiritual insight was the engine, and the political expression was the inevitable result of applying an absolute moral standard to a tragically flawed world. She was attempting to live a life governed by grace, and grace demands a fundamental change in the relationship between the self and the world, a relationship that can only be healed by transcendence.
Ultimately, Simone Weil's enduring legacy is that her powerful analysis of affliction provides the most incisive lens for critiquing modern social and economic oppression. Affliction is the political reality of force and uprootedness imposed by exploitative human structures. Her lasting contribution lies in her practical advocacy for a society structured around universal human needs and reciprocal obligations. For Weil, her mysticism served to sharpen and deepen her commitment to concrete revolutionary action on this earth.
I come at it from a different way, but ultimately used her direct experience of oppression, of malheur, to illustrate a profound theological truth, that only through the necessary destruction and emptying of the self, through decreation, can one achieve true justice, attention, and union with God. The political solutions she sought, the decentralized workshops, the framework of obligations, were powerful reflections of this absolute, transcendent spiritual standard, aimed at minimizing human puissance so that the spiritual act of consent might be possible.
The debate over Simone Weil's work continues precisely because she refused to accept the separation between the political earth and the spiritual heaven.
She forces us to confront whether the most crucial path to human freedom requires changing the structure of the world or fundamentally changing the structure of the self.
We encourage you to explore her writings, particularly Gravity and Grace and The Need for Roots, to discern the precise weighting of these two powerful, eternally conflicting forces in her life, gravity and grace.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.